They say a moment's weight is measured by its lingering presence, a yardstick against time itself. By that measure, the night Ethan and I shared on the brownstone steps must weigh 1,000 lifetimes, maybe more. It was a humid New York summer night, the kind where the city exhales a thick, sticky breath and the distant sirens become a lullaby. Richard, my husband, was, as usual, swallowed by another coast-to-coast business trip, leaving me alone in the echoing brownstone with Ethan. Being outside wasn't part of my plan that night. The city's relentless energy usually pulled me in, not out. But the stillness, a rare pocket in the city's roar, beckoned. I found Ethan already there, sprawled on the steps, a worn paperback in his hand. He looked up as I pushed open the heavy front door, the dim porch light catching the dark intensity of his eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that barely cut through the city's hum. I shook my head, settling onto the cool stone step beside him. Just needed air. We sat in silence, the city sounds a distant murmur. The silence was comfortable at first, a shared quietude. But as minutes stretched into an unknown expanse, it thickened, charged with an undercurrent I couldn't name, couldn't place. Then, in a flash, the world tilted. A casual brush of his hand against mine, a fleeting contact in the dim light, sent a shockwave through me, like a live wire had been touched. When I turned to look at him, everything shifted. Neither of us spoke. He leaned in, a slow, deliberate motion, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was tentative, electric, a spark in the dark. It was over in a heartbeat, but it detonated inside me, leaving my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled back, my mind a chaotic storm of thoughts, none of them making any sense. Ethan's face mirrored my own. Shock, disbelief, and something deeper, something raw and unnamed. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the city's drone. I stood abruptly, my legs shaky, backing towards the heavy oak door. We can't," I stammered, the words hollow, meaningless even to my own ears. Then I fled, leaving Ethan alone on the brownstone steps, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me, a physical force. The ghost of that kiss clung to me, a phantom touch threading its way into my thoughts, coloring everything I did in the days that followed. It was like stumbling upon a hidden door I never knew existed, and now that it was open, I couldn't slam it shut. But that night, on the steps, I wasn't thinking about doors or choices or consequences. It was just us, Sarah and Ethan, side by side in the humid twilight of a city summer night. The city breathed around us, a constant pulse. I hadn't intended to join him. He looked so at ease there, a book balanced on his knee, the faint glow of his phone occasionally illuminating his face. But something drew me out of the stifling brownstone and onto the steps. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe, more truthfully, it was him. "You're not usually out here," Ethan said, his voice low and easy, as if he'd been expecting me. "Needed a break," I replied, settling beside him on the cold stone. "Sometimes this place feels too big when Richard's gone." Ethan smirked, his gaze drifting out towards the street, the distant glow of traffic lights painting streaks across the humid air. "It always feels big to me, like it was built for someone else." I glanced at him, surprised by the sudden weight in his tone. Ethan wasn't one for emotional confessions. He was the strong, silent type, quick with a sardonic comment or a deflecting grin. Hearing this vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked, gently. He shrugged, his fingers idly tracing the edge of the book in his lap. "I guess I've always felt out of place, like I don't quite fit Richard's idea of things. This brownstone, this life, it's not really mine." His words stung, even though I knew they weren't directed at me. I'd spent years walking the tightrope between Ethan and Richard, trying to smooth over their friction, subtly encouraging them to connect. But I'd always sensed a chasm between them, a divide I couldn't bridge. "I'm sorry," I said after a moment, the city sound suddenly louder. "I didn't realize you felt that way." He looked at me then, his dark eyes searching mine, intense and unsettling. "You're different, Sarah. You're the only one who's ever really listened." There was something raw in his gaze, something that made my breath catch. I looked away, focusing on the hazy horizon where the last vestiges of daylight were bleeding into the deepening city night. "It's just how I am," I said softly, unsure how to respond to such unexpected openness. "No," he said, his voice firmer now. "It's not just how you are. You care, even when you don't have to. That's rare." His words settled over me like a warm blanket in the cool night air, and for a moment, I was speechless. Then, as if moved by an unseen force, I reached out and placed a hand on his. The gesture was meant to be comforting, nothing more, but the instant our hands connected, the air between us crackled. The distant city sounds seemed to fade, the world narrowing, focusing until it was just us, two figures on brownstone steps in the New York night. "Ethan," I began, my voice faltering, breathy. He turned his hand over, his fingers interlacing with mine. The touch was light, hesitant, yet it sent a ripple of heat through me, chasing away the city chill. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper, charged with an unspoken question. I should have pulled away. I should have stood up, walked back inside, pretended this moment never happened, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, my hand resting in his as he leaned closer. His eyes searched mine, seeking hesitation, doubt. And when he found none, he closed the remaining distance. The kiss was soft, almost imperceptible at first, as if he were giving me a final chance to stop him. But I didn't. I couldn't. When his lips met mine, it was like a match striking, igniting a flame I hadn't even known was smoldering within me. The kiss deepened, tentative and full of unspoken questions, yet holding a depth that made my heart ache with a longing I couldn't explain. I pulled away after a moment, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "This isn't," I began, but the sentence fractured, incomplete. "This isn't what?" he asked, his voice low and steady, his eyes never leaving mine. "Wrong? Because it doesn't feel wrong." "It's not about how it feels," I said, though even to my own ears my words sounded hollow, a flimsy shield against a truth that was rapidly dismantling my carefully constructed world. He didn't argue, didn't push. Instead, he leaned back, his eyes holding mine with a quiet intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I'm sorry," he said after a long pause, the city sounds creeping back into the silence. "I didn't mean to make things complicated." "It's already complicated," I replied, my voice softer than I intended, the weight of years of unspoken emotions suddenly pressing down. We sat in silence after that, the city humming around us, the night settling in. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the suffocating tension, but every word that came to mind felt inadequate, a clumsy hammer against fragile glass. Eventually I stood, my legs unsteady as I stepped away from the steps. "Good night, Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, Sarah," he replied, his tone unreadable, a closed door. I didn't look back as I slipped inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, sealing me in with the echoes of the night. But as I climbed the creaking stairs to my bedroom, I could still feel the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his hand in mine, the ghost of his lips against mine. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. Sleep was a phantom that night. The brownstone, usually a sanctuary of quiet when Richard was away, felt deafeningly loud. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren wail, every rustle of wind from the city streets seemed like a mocking reminder of the secret I now carried, a heavy stone in my chest. When dawn finally cracked through the city haze, I dragged myself out of bed and into the kitchen, hoping the mundane ritual of making coffee might quiet the storm in my mind. But even the familiar rhythm of grinding beans and the comforting aroma couldn't stop my thoughts from circling back to the steps, to Ethan, to the forbidden sweetness of his kiss. I told myself it was a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment fueled by loneliness and the strange intimacy of a city summer night. But the truth, the raw, undeniable truth, was harder to swallow. I'd wanted it. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled me from my spiraling thoughts. I turned to see Ethan enter the kitchen, his dark hair tousled, his t-shirt rumpled as if he'd barely slept either. "Morning," he said, his voice scratchy but warm, the same voice that had whispered my name on the steps. "Morning," I replied, trying to inject a lightness into my tone that felt utterly false. I busied myself at the counter, pretending to focus on the coffee. He poured himself a cup, the clinking of the ceramic mug echoing in the sudden silence, and leaned against the counter, watching me. His presence filled the small kitchen, and I felt the tension rise, thick and suffocating like steam from the percolator. "I've been thinking about last night," he said finally, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I froze, my hand gripping the coffee scoop a little too tightly. "Ethan, we can't—" "I know," he interrupted, his gaze steady, unwavering. I don't regret it." His words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I turned to face him, my chest tightening, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "You should," I said, though my voice wavered, betraying the lie. Do you? He asked, stepping closer, closing the already minimal space between us. I opened my mouth to respond, to say the words I knew I should say, the words that would rebuild the walls I was desperately trying to maintain. But no words came. The truth lodged itself in my throat, a heavy, suffocating stone. The insistent buzz of my phone on the counter shattered the charged silence, a jarring intrusion. I grabbed it quickly, grateful for the sudden, unexpected distraction. But the relief was short-lived. The name flashing on the screen was Miriam. Miriam, my closest friend, the one person who could see straight through me, no matter how carefully I constructed my facade. We met for brunch later that morning at a small cafe in the West Village, a familiar haven in the city's relentless pulse. I spent the entire cab ride rehearsing deflections, crafting a narrative that would explain away the sleepless night, the tension radiating from me like heat. She was already seated at our usual table when I arrived, her bright auburn hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, her green eyes sharp and observant. "There you are," she said with a smile, but there was a subtle edge to it. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." "Never," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle even to my own ears, sliding into the chair across from her. She studied me for a long moment, her green eyes narrowing, scrutinizing my face. "You look tired, Sarah. Everything okay?" "Just didn't sleep well," I said, waving a hand dismissively, trying to appear casual. "You know how it is when Richard's away. This place feels empty." Miriam tilted her head, her expression softening slightly, but her gaze remained sharp. "I guess. But you've been looking a little off for a while now. Is there something you're not telling me?" "No," I said quickly. Too quickly, the denial hanging in the air like a neon sign. Her eyes narrowed further, and I cursed myself inwardly for being so transparent, so easily read. But before she could press further, the waitress arrived with our drinks. A timely interruption that shifted the conversation, for the moment, to safer territory. We talked about neighborhood gossip, updates on Miriam's never-ending apartment renovation, plans for an upcoming art fair in the park. Still, beneath the surface chatter, I couldn't shake the feeling that she saw through me, that my carefully constructed walls were crumbling, brick by brick. When I returned to the brownstone that afternoon, the silence was heavier, more oppressive than before. Ethan wasn't in the living room, or the kitchen, or the library. For a moment, a wave of relief washed over me, quickly followed by a sharp pang of something else, something akin to disappointment. Then, I heard the faint strains of music drifting from the back terrace. I found him there, sitting on the steps, the same steps where everything had shifted, his phone in one hand, a can of beer in the other. He looked up when he saw me, his expression unreadable, guarded. "Hey," he said, his voice low, carefully neutral. "Hey," I replied, stepping onto the terrace, the city sounds a muted backdrop. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of the previous night hung heavy between us, an unspoken question hanging in the humid air, a question neither of us dared to answer directly. Finally, Ethan broke the silence, his gaze fixed on the skyline in the distance. "You're mad at me." It wasn't a question, but a statement, delivered with a quiet certainty. "No," I said quickly, too quickly again, the denial a reflexive shield. But the word felt like a lie, a hollow echo in the charged silence. "Then what?" he asked, turning to face me fully, his eyes searching mine. I sighed, leaning against the railing, the city breeze ruffling my hair. "I'm mad at myself," I admitted, the truth finally breaking through the carefully constructed walls. Because I should have stopped it, because I didn't. He stood then, closing the distance between us in a few steps, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the confined space of the terrace. "It wasn't just you, Sarah. We're both in this." His words were like a lifeline and an anchor, pulling me back from the edge of the precipice, while simultaneously dragging me deeper into something I wasn't sure I could escape. "We can't," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the city sound suddenly deafening. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, a light, tentative touch that sent a familiar jolt through me. "Why not?" "Because it's wrong," I said, though the conviction in my voice was fading, dissolving in the face of his unwavering gaze. "Is it?" he asked, his gaze steady, challenging. "Or are we just afraid of what people would think?" His words hung in the air, a stark question mark, challenging everything I'd told myself to believe, everything I'd clung to for years. I pulled my hand away, stepping back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm I was desperately trying to maintain. I need time, I said finally, my voice shaking, betraying the turmoil raging within me. Ethan nodded, his expression softening, the intensity in his eyes receding, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. Take all the time you need, he said, his voice quiet, resonant with a hidden depth. I'm not going anywhere. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, the city lights painting faint shadows across the room, I replayed his words over and over in my mind. I'm not going anywhere. I knew what was at stake, knew the risks we were taking, the precarious path we were on. But for the first time in years, a long, suffocating silence, I felt something I hadn't even realized I was missing, alive. And that, more than anything else, terrified me. The days that followed my conversation with Ethan stretched into a strange, unsettling limbo. I buried myself in routine, in the mundane tasks of daily life, cleaning the brownstone, running errands, losing myself in the city's relentless motion, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to that night on the steps. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of his words, his touch, lingered, a phantom sensation, a song stuck on repeat in my mind. Ethan, for his part, seemed to be giving me the space I'd asked for, or perhaps demanded. He wasn't cold or distant, but he didn't push either. It was as if we'd reached a fragile, unspoken truce, both of us stepping carefully around the charged electric tension that crackled between us, a live wire humming beneath the surface. Then, one sweltering afternoon, the truce shattered. It started innocently enough. I decided to tackle the storage room in the basement, a task I'd been putting off for months, a black hole of forgotten memories and accumulated junk. The room was a chaotic mess of old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs, and I was determined to make some progress before the city heat became unbearable, driving me back into the air-conditioned confines of the brownstone. I was halfway through dragging a heavy, ornate mirror towards the narrow basement door when Ethan appeared in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the dusty concrete floor. "Need a hand?" he asked, his tone light, casual, as if he'd just stumbled upon me by chance. I straightened, brushing a strand of hair from my sweat-dampened forehead, the city humidity clinging to me like a second skin. "You don't have to," I said, though a part of me, a treacherous, undeniable part, was relieved by his unexpected presence. "I know you hate this stuff." He grinned, stepping inside, the dim light casting shadows across his face. "Maybe I just wanted to keep you company." I rolled my eyes, a reflexive gesture, but didn't argue. In the close, dusty confines of the storage room, we worked in a companionable silence, hauling out forgotten relics of the past. Broken chairs, stacks of yellowed newspapers, boxes overflowing with faded photographs. The basement grew hotter as the afternoon sun beat down on the city, the air thick and stagnant, and soon my shirt clung to my back, damp with sweat. "I think that's the last of it," I said, wiping my forehead with the back of my hand, leaning against a rickety wooden shelf, exhausted but strangely invigorated by the physical labor. Ethan sat down on an overturned crate of tools, the dust swirling around him in the dim light, and turned to face me, his chest rising and falling with the effort of lifting and hauling. "You've been avoiding me," he said abruptly, the words catching me off guard, slicing through the companionable silence. "I haven't," I protested, the denial automatic, ingrained. "You have," he interrupted, his gaze steady, unwavering, holding mine captive. "And I get it. I do. But you don't have to keep punishing yourself, Sarah." "I'm not punishing myself," I said, though even as the words left my lips, they sounded hollow, unconvincing. He stepped closer, the dim light softening his features, his expression shifting, becoming less accusatory, more vulnerable. "Then what are you doing?" I looked away, my fingers gripping the rough edge of the wooden shelf, the dust gritty beneath my fingertips. "I'm trying to figure out how to stop this, before it gets any worse." "Worse?" he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief, a raw edge of hurt creeping in. "You make it sound like this is some kind of disaster." "Isn't it?" I asked, finally meeting his gaze, the question hanging in the air between us, heavy and unanswered. "You're my stepson, Ethan. This isn't normal." "Who cares about normal?" he said, his voice rising, the quiet intensity breaking, cracking into something more urgent, more desperate. "I care about you, Sarah. Doesn't that count for something?" His words hung in the air, raw and unguarded, a desperate plea. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, shallow and uneven, the distant hum of the city filtering down through the basement walls. It's not that simple, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of years of societal conditioning pressing down on me. Maybe it is, he replied, taking another step closer, closing the remaining space between us, his presence overwhelming in the confined, dusty room. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the intensity of his gaze pulling me in, a magnetic force I was powerless to resist. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. As if moved by an unseen force, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine, a feather-light touch that ignited a firestorm within me. "Ethan," I began, my voice catching in my throat, the rest of the words dissolving, lost in the rising tide of emotion. As if in answer, he leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation, no tentative exploration. His lips found mine with a confidence, a certainty that sent a jolt of pure electricity through me. And before I could even think to stop myself, I was kissing him back, surrendering to the forbidden pull, the undeniable connection that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks, months, maybe even years. The world around us seemed to blur, the dust and heat and dim light of the basement fading into nothingness as I lost myself in him, in the desperate urgency of his kiss. His hands were warm and steady as they settled on my waist, pulling me closer, molding our bodies together. And for a fleeting, reckless moment, I forgot everything. Richard, the brownstone, the impossible consequences, the shattering fallout that was sure to come. When we finally broke apart, breathless, shaken, the silence in the basement was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. My cheeks were flushed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "We can't do this," I said, though the words lacked conviction, a hollow echo of what I knew I should be saying, what I knew was right, responsible, sane. "Yes, we can," he replied, his voice steady, unwavering, his gaze locked on mine. "If we want to." The storage room in the basement wasn't the last place. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and I found ourselves drawn together again and again, like moths to a dangerous flame, each encounter a little riskier, a little more reckless than the last. There was the night at the summer house on Long Island, a weekend escape from the city's relentless pressure, when I'd gone there to clear my head, to find some semblance of peace, and found him waiting, his presence as natural and inevitable as the rustling of the trees outside. We'd spent hours talking, our voices barely above whispers in the quiet house, until the fragile, self-imposed distance between us dissolved once more, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of our connection. Then there was the drive into the city for groceries, a mundane errand that transformed into something charged and dangerous when a sudden summer storm erupted, forcing us to pull over on a deserted side street in Brooklyn. The intimacy of the car, the drumming rain pounding against the roof, the world outside fading into a blurry watercolor, created a tension so thick, so suffocating I could barely breathe. And then there was the night Richard came home early, unexpectedly, shattering the fragile illusion of normalcy we'd been desperately trying to maintain. I was in the kitchen, setting the table for dinner, the city lights painting long shadows across the countertops, when I heard the unmistakable sound of his car pulling into the driveway, the crunch of tires on gravel. My stomach dropped, a sudden plummet into icy fear. It was too early for him to be home. Ethan, who'd been helping me with the dishes, his presence a familiar comfort in the quiet kitchen, froze beside me, his movements arrested. "Did he say he was coming back today?" he asked, his voice low, urgent, barely audible above the city's muffled sounds. "No," I whispered, my heart pounding against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. We moved quickly, instinctively, a silent, practiced dance of deception. Ethan grabbed the dish towel, disappearing into the living room, melting into the shadows as I frantically tried to compose myself, to erase the telltale signs of our stolen moments, to construct a mask of normalcy before Richard walked through the door. When Richard walked through the door, he looked tired but pleased, his briefcase slung over one shoulder, the weight of his city life evident in the lines around his eyes. "Surprise," he said with a forced grin, leaning in to kiss my cheek, the gesture perfunctory, devoid of warmth. "You're home early," I said, my voice strained, the forced smile feeling brittle and unnatural on my face. "Thought I'd take a break from the chaos," he replied, glancing into the living room, his gaze lingering on the empty space where Ethan had just been moments before. "Ethan, good to see you." "You too, Richard," Ethan said, his tone carefully casual, neutral, betraying nothing. The dinner that followed was one of the most excruciating experiences of my life. A tense tableau played out under the harsh kitchen lights. Every glance, every forced smile, every carefully chosen word felt magnified, distorted, imbued with a hidden meaning that only Ethan and I understood. I was painfully aware of Ethan's presence at the table, the silent weight of his gaze on me, even when I wasn't looking directly at him, a constant, unsettling pressure. The weight of our secret pressed down on me, suffocating me, a heavy stone in my chest. Afterward, as Richard settled into the living room with his laptop, the city sounds a distant hum beyond the windows, Ethan found me in the kitchen, the silence between us thick and suffocating. "That was close," he said, his voice low, barely a whisper, the tension still radiating from him. "Too close," I replied, my hands trembling as I loaded the dishwasher, the clatter of the plates a jarring counterpoint to the silence. "We'll be more careful," he said, his hand brushing mine, a fleeting, forbidden touch that sent a shiver down my spine. "We have to stop," I whispered. Though even as the words left my lips, I knew I didn't mean them, the desire for him too powerful, too deeply ingrained to simply extinguish. Ethan's eyes searched mine, a silent question hanging in the air between us. He nodded slowly, reluctantly, his gaze lingering on mine. "If that's what you want." But it wasn't what I wanted, and we both knew it. The trouble with secrets, I was learning, is they're never as hidden as you think. They have a way of seeping into the edges of your life, staining even the most ordinary moments with a hidden hue, coloring everything with a layer of deception. I'd been careful, or at least I thought I had been, meticulously constructing a facade of normalcy, carefully masking the truth of what was happening beneath the surface. But the evening Miriam confronted me, the carefully constructed walls began to crumble, and I realized with a chilling certainty how much I'd underestimated her, how much she saw, how deeply she knew me. It was a weeknight, the city lights painting streaks across the night sky, and Miriam had stopped by unannounced, a bottle of wine in hand, a plate of homemade cookies balanced precariously on top, a peace offering, or perhaps something more. Richard had retreated to bed early, exhausted from another demanding day in the city, and Ethan was out on one of his late-night drives, seeking solace in the anonymity of the city streets, leaving the brownstone quiet and still, a deceptive calm before the storm. "Thought you could use some company," Miriam said cheerfully, her smile bright, almost too bright, as she set the plate on the counter, the aroma of warm cookies filling the kitchen. I forced a smile, my heart already racing, a frantic drumbeat of apprehension. "Always," I managed to say, my voice betraying nothing, or so I hoped. "Let me grab some glasses." We settled in the living room, the city sounds a distant murmur through the closed windows, the bottle of wine between us, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. For a while, the conversation was easy, light, surface level. She told me about her ongoing battles with the co-op board, about the new yoga studio that had opened down the street, about her daughter's latest career aspirations, the mundane details of city life, the everyday tapestry of our shared world. But then her tone shifted, the lightness fading, replaced by a subtle gravity. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she leaned forward, her gaze sharp, penetrating. "Sarah," she said, her voice quieter now, the city sound seeming to fade into a distant hum. "Can I ask you something?" My stomach tightened, a cold knot of dread forming in my gut. "Of course," I said, bracing myself, the city air suddenly feeling thin, suffocating. "It's about Ethan," she said, watching me closely, her green eyes unwavering, searching mine for a flicker of truth, a crack in my carefully constructed facade. I froze, the wine glass halfway to my lips, the city noise fading into a deafening silence. "What about him?" Miriam hesitated, her gaze searching mine, assessing my reaction, measuring my carefully neutral expression. "It's probably nothing," she said, her tone carefully casual, almost dismissive, but I knew Miriam too well to believe it. "But the other day at the grocery store, I saw the two of you—" She trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air, heavy with implication, her expression unreadable, a carefully constructed mask. "And?" I prompted, my voice steadier than I felt, forcing myself to meet her gaze to maintain the illusion of composure. She leaned back, sighing, the city sounds creeping back into the silence. "It's just, you seemed close. I mean, I know you're close. You've always been close, but this felt different." The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around me, the city lights outside suddenly harsh and glaring. I forced a laugh, shaking my head, a brittle, unconvincing sound. Miriam, you're imagining things. Ethan and I were just running errands. Maybe, she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe a word of it, the doubt lingering in her eyes, a silent accusation. But I know you, Sarah, and I know when something's not right. I set my wine glass down on the coffee table, the clinking of the glass echoing in the suddenly oppressive silence, my hands trembling, betraying the carefully constructed facade of calm. There's nothing to worry about, I said firmly, too firmly, the denial ringing hollow even to my own ears. Miriam studied me for a long, agonizing moment, her gaze unwavering, penetrating. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, she conceded, or pretended to concede. If you say so. But the doubt in her eyes lingered, a dark cloud casting a shadow over the fragile truce, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the conversation, the unspoken accusation, was far from over. That night, the city sounds a constant drone outside the windows. I found Ethan in the garage, a cavernous space beneath the brownstone, leaning against the hood of his car, his arms crossed, his silhouette a dark shape in the dim light. He looked up as I approached, his expression softening when he saw the raw fear etched on my face, the tremor in my hands. What happened? He asked, straightening, the city sounds fading as I stepped inside, closing the heavy garage door behind me, sealing us in with our shared secret. Miriam, I said simply, the name hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, the softness in his expression hardening into a grim resolve. What did she say? She saw us at the store, I said, my voice low, barely a whisper. The city sounds muffled now, distant. She thinks something's going on. Ethan's brow furrowed, his gaze intense, searching mine. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine, a fleeting, forbidden touch that sent a familiar jolt through me, a spark in the darkness. What did you tell her? I denied everything, I said, my voice trembling, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. But she doesn't believe me. He exhaled sharply, a frustrated breath that hung in the still air of the garage, his fingers tightening around mine, his grip firm, grounding. Sarah, it's going to be okay. I pulled away, pacing the length of the garage, the concrete floor cold beneath my bare feet. The city sounds a distant, muffled rumble. No, it's not. If Miriam suspects something, it's only a matter of time before Richard does too. And then, the unspoken consequences hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud threatening to engulf us. Then let's leave, he said suddenly, the words sharp, decisive, cutting through the suffocating fear. I froze, turning to face him, my breath catching in my throat, the city sounds fading into a ringing silence. What? Let's leave, he repeated, his voice steady, unwavering, the words echoing in the cavernous space of the garage. We'll go somewhere else. Start over. His words sent a pang through me, a confusing mixture of longing and fear, hope and despair, something I couldn't quite name, couldn't quite grasp. Ethan, that's not possible, I said, shaking my head, the city lights filtering through the grimy garage windows, casting long, distorted shadows. I can't just leave. Why not? He asked, his voice rising, a note of desperation creeping in, the carefully constructed facade of control beginning to crack. Because of Richard, I said, the name a weight on my tongue, a shackle binding me to a life I no longer recognized, because of what people might think, because of everything. My voice broke, the carefully constructed walls finally crumbling, the city sounds a distant, mocking laughter. My life is here, Ethan, my whole life. His expression softened, the intensity in his eyes receding, replaced by a heartbreaking tenderness. He stepped closer, his hand settling on my shoulders. His touch gentle, reassuring, yet sending a tremor of longing through me. What kind of life is it, Sarah? He asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The city sounds a distant murmur. If you're not happy. I didn't have an answer. The turning point came 2 days later during a summer storm that rolled in unexpectedly, a sudden, violent eruption of nature in the heart of the city, bringing sheets of torrential rain and howling winds that rattled the brownstone windows and drowned out the city's relentless hum. Richard was out at a business dinner, another late night swallowed by the demands of his city life, leaving Ethan and me alone in the echoing brownstone, the storm raging outside a mirror of the turmoil within. I was in the living room, staring out the rain-streaked window, the city lights blurred and distorted by the downpour, the storm a visual representation of the chaos swirling within me, when Ethan found me, his presence a silent question in the doorway. "You're thinking about leaving, aren't you?" he said, his voice soft, barely audible above the roar of the storm, yet cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. I turned to face him, my chest tightening, my breath catching in my throat. The city sounds a deafening roar. "I don't know what I'm thinking," I confessed, the truth spilling out, raw and unguarded, the storm outside mirroring the tempest within my own soul. He crossed the room, his presence grounding me, a solid anchor in the swirling chaos even as my thoughts spun in 1,000 directions, a dizzying vortex of fear and desire and impossible choices. "You're scared," he said, his voice steady, unwavering, his gaze locked on mine, seeing straight through the carefully constructed facade into the raw, vulnerable heart beneath. "Of course I'm scared," I said, my voice cracking, breaking under the weight of unspoken fears. The city sounds a mocking chorus. "This isn't a game, Ethan. This is my life. Your life." He stepped closer, the storm raging outside, the rain lashing against the windows like a warning, his eyes holding mine captive, unwavering in their intensity. "Then let's make it our life," he said, the words like a lifeline thrown into the raging storm, pulling me back from the edge of despair. And for the first time in weeks, months, maybe even years, I allowed myself to imagine it. A different life, a life beyond the confines of the brownstone walls, a life where the secrets and lies were gone, where I didn't have to look over my shoulder, to second-guess every moment, to live in constant fear of discovery. But the image was fleeting, ephemeral, a fragile dream that dissolved as quickly as it formed, shattered by the harsh reality of my impossible situation. "I can't," I said, tears welling in my eyes, hot and stinging, the storm outside mirroring the tempest within. Ethan's expression softened, the intensity fading, replaced by a heartbreaking tenderness, a quiet understanding. He reached out his hand, brushing my cheek, his touch gentle, comforting, yet sending a tremor of longing through me. "I'm not giving up on you, Sarah," he said, his voice low, resonant with a fierce, unwavering determination. "Not ever." The storm raged on outside, the rain lashing against the windows like a furious warning. The city sounds a deafening roar, but in that moment, amidst the chaos and fear, I felt a fragile sense of peace, a glimmer of hope in the darkness, a desperate, reckless belief that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way through the storm together, emerge on the other side, battered and bruised, but somehow miraculously whole. The storm outside had faded by morning, receding as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a city that felt strangely washed clean, the air crisp and fresh, the sky a pale, watery blue. But inside me, the turmoil raged on, the storm within still howling, unresolved, threatening to tear everything apart. Ethan had stayed out late that night, likely driving aimlessly through the city streets, seeking refuge in the anonymity of the urban landscape, a familiar pattern when his thoughts became too tangled, too overwhelming. By the time I woke up, the city sounds a distant hum, his car was back in the driveway, parked in its usual spot, and the brownstone was silent again, enveloped in an uneasy calm. Richard had already left for the office, swallowed by the city's relentless demands and the heavy weight of the day, of the impossible choices looming before me, pressed down on me like a physical burden as I stood in the kitchen, staring out at the rain-soaked city, the world outside mirroring the storm within. I'd made coffee, the familiar aroma filling the quiet kitchen, a small attempt at normalcy, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. My hands were trembling too much, my thoughts looping endlessly through the same questions, the same impossible choices, the same agonizing uncertainty. When Ethan appeared in the doorway, his dark hair tousled, his t-shirt wrinkled, the sight of him, even in his disheveled state, sent a sharp pang of longing through my chest. A painful reminder of everything I was teetering on the edge of losing. He was holding something in his hands, a folded piece of paper, a letter. "Morning," he said, his voice low, quiet. The city sounds a muted backdrop. "Morning," I replied, though the word came out hollow, breathy, devoid of any real meaning. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine, his gaze intense, unsettling, reading the turmoil etched on my face, the unspoken question swirling in my eyes. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he crossed the room and set the letter on the counter in front of me, the folded paper a stark white against the dark countertop. "What's this?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat, a sudden flutter of apprehension and anticipation. It's for you, he said simply, his voice quiet, yet resonant with an undercurrent of emotion I couldn't quite decipher. I picked up the envelope, my fingers brushing against the edge, the paper thin and slightly crumpled. It wasn't sealed, an open invitation, or perhaps a final plea. And when I opened it, my hands trembling, I found a single piece of paper inside, filled with Ethan's unmistakable handwriting, his familiar scrawl both comforting and terrifying. The city sounds faded as I read, the words blurring through the tears that welled in my eyes, hot and stinging. Sarah, it began, the simple salutation sending a fresh wave of emotion crashing over me. I meant every word I've said about you, about us. And I know this is the hardest thing you've ever had to face, but I also know you. You're stronger than you think, braver than you realize. If you want to walk away, I'll let you. But if there's even a part of you that wants this, wants me, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Ethan. My hands shook violently as I finished reading, the words sinking into my heart, planting themselves deep within my soul, a seed of hope and despair intertwined. I looked up at him, my vision blurred by tears, the city lights a hazy glow beyond the kitchen window. But he wasn't watching me, wasn't waiting for my reaction. His gaze was fixed on the window, on the rain-soaked city beyond, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable, a closed book. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked, my voice trembling, barely above a whisper, the city sounds a distant hum. "Because I need you to know," he said, turning to face me, his eyes meeting mine, locking onto my gaze, unwavering in their intensity. "No matter what you decide, I need you to know how I feel." I set the letter down carefully on the counter, the paper suddenly feeling heavy in my hands, my chest tight, constricted, unable to draw a full breath. "Ethan, this isn't easy for me," I said, the words a desperate plea for understanding, for compassion, for a way out of this impossible situation. "I know," he said softly, his voice gentle, understanding, the air between us heavy, thick with all the things we couldn't say, all the unspoken emotions swirling between us, a silent tempest. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, that I wanted him as much as he wanted me, that the longing for him was a constant ache within me, a void that only he could fill. But the words caught in my throat, choked by fear, by doubt, by the weight of years of societal conditioning, of ingrained expectations. "I don't want to ruin your life," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The city sounds a distant, mocking echo. "You won't," he replied, his voice firm, unwavering, a stark contrast to my own trembling uncertainty. "But you might ruin yours, Sarah, if you keep pretending this doesn't matter, if you keep denying what's real." That evening, Richard came home early, his mood unusually cheerful, buoyant, oblivious to the storm raging beneath the surface of our carefully constructed facade. He poured himself a glass of wine, the clinking of the glass a sharp sound in the tense silence, and talked about his latest business deal, a triumphant monologue about numbers and percentages and corporate victories, lost in his own world, completely unaware of the silent drama unfolding around him. Ethan was quiet, withdrawn, offering polite responses, carefully measured, betraying nothing, a mask of casual indifference firmly in place. I, meanwhile, could barely look at either of them, my gaze darting between them, trapped between two impossible choices, two vastly different lives. When dinner was finally over, the strained silence broken only by Richard's oblivious chatter, Richard retreated to his office, swallowed once more by the demands of his city life, leaving Ethan and me alone in the kitchen, the silence between us unbearable, suffocating. I could feel his eyes on me, a silent, questioning gaze as I loaded the dishwasher, my hands trembling, the clatter of the dishes a desperate attempt to break the oppressive silence. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice low, resonant with an unspoken urgency. I didn't turn around, couldn't face him, couldn't bear to see the question in his eyes, the plea for an answer I didn't know if I could give. "Don't," I whispered, my voice barely audible, a desperate plea for him to stop, to retreat, to let me cling to the fragile illusion of normalcy a little longer. But he didn't listen, couldn't stop. The momentum of our unspoken connection too powerful, too deeply ingrained to simply ignore. I felt him step closer, his presence looming behind me, the heat radiating from his body, a physical manifestation of the emotional firestorm raging between us. His hand brushed lightly against my arm, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt of electricity through me, a spark in the darkness. "I'm not trying to push you," he said softly, his voice gentle, understanding, yet laced with an undeniable urgency. I I need to know where we stand. I turned to face him then, finally, my heart pounding against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and desire, hope and despair. His expression was open, vulnerable, stripped bare of all pretense, and it broke something within me, shattered the last vestiges of resistance, the final remnants of denial. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaking, the words a desperate plea for sanity, for escape. "Why not?" he asked, his tone steady, unwavering, his gaze locked on mine, challenging me to confront the raw, undeniable truth. "Because it's too much," I replied, tears threatening to spill, hot and stinging, the weight of secrets and lies and impossible choices crushing me, suffocating me. The lies, the secrecy, the risk, it's too much. He reached out his hand, cupping my cheek, his touch warm, comforting, yet sending a tremor of longing through me. "Do you love me?" The question caught me off guard, stealing the air from my lungs, leaving me breathless, speechless. For a moment, the city sounds faded, the world narrowed, focusing on the raw, undeniable truth of his question, the stark simplicity of his demand. "Yes," I admitted, the word barely audible, a whispered confession, a surrender to the inevitable. "Then that's all that matters," he said, his voice fierce, unwavering, the words a declaration of war against the impossible odds, against the insurmountable obstacles standing between us. "It's not that simple," I said, pulling away, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm I still desperately clung to. "Maybe it is," he replied, his gaze steady, unwavering, holding mine captive. "Maybe we just need to stop being afraid." That night, the city lights painting shadows across the bedroom ceiling, I lay awake in bed, staring into the darkness, Richard asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even, oblivious to the turmoil raging within me, the impossible choices tearing me apart. I thought about Ethan's letter, about his words, about the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the unwavering certainty in his voice. And for the first time, truly, honestly, allowed myself to imagine a different life. A life beyond the confines of the brownstone walls. A life where I didn't have to hide, to lie, to live in constant fear. A life where I could be with him, openly, freely, without shame or guilt or fear. But as much as I wanted that life, craved it with every fiber of my being, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wasn't possible. Not here, not now. Not in this city, in this life, in this impossible situation. When morning came, the city waking up around us, a distant rumble of traffic and sirens, I found Ethan in the kitchen, his bag packed, slung over one shoulder ready to leave, to disappear back into the anonymity of the city streets. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of composure, hiding the turmoil beneath. "You're leaving?" I asked, my voice catching in my throat, the words a painful confirmation of the inevitable. He nodded, his gaze softening, the mask momentarily slipping, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. "For now," he said, his voice quiet, gentle, yet resonant with a hidden pain. "I think we both need some space." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening, a vice grip squeezing the air from my lungs. The city sounds a distant, mocking chorus. "Where will you go?" I asked, the question a desperate attempt to hold on to something, to maintain some semblance of connection, even as he was slipping away. "Does it matter?" he asked gently, his eyes searching mine, a silent plea for understanding, for acceptance. "Yes," I said, my voice breaking, the tears finally spilling, hot and unchecked, streaming down my face. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine, a fleeting, tender touch, a final goodbye. "I'll be back," he whispered, his voice resonant with a fierce, unwavering promise. "When you're ready." I nodded, unable to speak, the tears choking me, the city sounds fading into a ringing silence. And then he was gone, walking out of the kitchen, out of the brownstone, out of my life, leaving me alone in the quiet kitchen, the door closing softly behind him, sealing me in with the echoes of what could have been, what might still be, or perhaps what was never meant to be. Months later, the city sounds a constant backdrop to my life. I still think about that summer, about those stolen moments, about the impossible choices I made and the ones I didn't, the paths I chose and the ones I left behind unexplored, forever lost. I think about Ethan, about the intensity of his gaze, the unwavering certainty of his love, and the way he made me feel alive, truly alive, in a way I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. I don't know what the future holds, the city stretching out before me, vast and unknowable, a labyrinth of possibilities and regrets. But I do know this, with a chilling certainty that settles deep within my bones. Some moments, some people leave marks that never fade, indelible imprints on the soul, etching themselves into the fabric of our being, forever shaping who we are, who we were, and who we might still become. And Ethan, the memory of his touch, the echo of his voice, the ghost of his kiss, is one of those moments, one of those people, a permanent mark on my soul, a lingering presence that time itself can never erase.